Great. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining for this second installment of Q&A with the Rav on the topic of Shabbat. Thank you very much to the Rav for giving up his time again. I think everyone knows the rules of these things, so I'm just going to go straight into the first question. First, in fact,
sorry to interrupt you,
yes,
Joshua,
sure.
but I feel that I must respond to a question that was asked by Adam or Chaim Olanov with regards to our last question and answer session. It has to do with making coffee on Shabbat. It's a very practical and important question, and therefore I will address it briefly. What Chaim writes, I saw this in a message that was sent to me. He writes as follows: generally, coffee beans are roasted at 200 to 202 degrees centigrade for 15 to 20 minutes. During this process, any liquid in the bean turns into gas and escapes the bean by creating cracks on the surface. The temperature of this gas or steam is double that of boiling water, in other words, 100 degrees centigrade. How is this not considered cooking? Goes on to ask, why can one not rely on the opinion she'en bishul ahar afiyah or sali'ah, that there is no such thing as cooking once something has been baked or roasted? As I said, this is an important question, in my view, for a number of reasons, and I feel that I must respond to it clearly. One reason I think it's important to answer is because most people drink tea and coffee on Shabbat, and many people prefer espresso coffee or Turkish coffee, what have you, on Shabbat, as opposed to instant coffee. The difference between instant coffee and other types of coffee, of course, is that instant coffee was cooked. I will explain what I mean by that. Instant coffee was cooked in hot water and then freeze-dried. So it was literally cooked in hot water. And even then, there are many poskim, and I would tend to agree, although I'm not absolutely definitive about this, who claim that it is more correct on Shabbat to put water into your cup first from the urn, from the meham, which is now a klishani, and then put the instant coffee into that, and not the other way around, not to pour the water directly from the kli rishon, which is an irui kli rishon, even though it was cooked. Because one could give a number of reasons, because possibly there is nevertheless some aspect of cooking or something similar to cooking involved in this. Keep in mind, the Rambam does write that if you place food that is completely cooked on the fire or a source of heat similar to fire and cook it on Shabbat, you are patur aval asur. It is patur min Torah because it's cooked, but it's nevertheless asur to do so, min divrei sofarim. Second of all, it's always a good idea to make a distinction between Chol and Shabbat, to make it very clear that we do things differently on Shabbat. But more specifically, to answer this question, the answer to the question, why is that not considered cooking, is as follows. Cooking is a broad term. Bishul in Hebrew is a very broad term. It includes cooking, that is to say, cooking in water or liquid. It includes frying, which is a similar process but uses oil instead of water or other liquids. It includes baking. It includes grilling. It includes also roasting. All of the above are considered bishul. But clearly these are not identical processes. A simple example, and I do not believe anyone will question this example. If I take a potato, a raw potato, cut it into slices and boil it in boiling water for half an hour, what will I have? I will have a boiled potato or boiled pieces of potato, which are entirely edible. No one will doubt this. But if I now take these same pieces of boiled potato and fry them in oil, I will now have fried potatoes or potato chips or French fries, whatever you wish to call them, correct? This is not the same kind of product. It tastes different, it looks different, because it is different. This is a different process, and if done on Shabbat, is an act of bishul, just as boiling them in water when they are raw would be an act of bishul. The fact that it was boiled before doesn't mean that it cannot now be fried, because frying changes the nature of this food now. It makes it somewhat different in a way that every normal person recognizes in exactly the same way. Roasting a coffee bean or a cocoa bean or what have you, or nuts. Take nuts, for example. You can eat many nuts. Almost all nuts, I think, you can eat raw, but many people prefer to roast them because it actually enhances the flavor. Not that they're inedible, but it improves the flavor in the opinion of many. And that is a process which falls under the definition of bishul. Roasting those coffee beans has an impact on them. It changes them in some way. As Chaim pointed out, there is a very high temperature involved, and it does enhance the flavor of those beans, but it does not cook them, because cooking is a process which is defined by cooking something in hot water or some other similar very hot liquid. That is the process of bishul, as opposed to the process known as afiyah, which is without liquid, or the process of kliya, of roasting, which is without liquid, or the process of grilling, which is without liquid. These are different processes, and they produce different results, and they make a clear and definite difference to the final product. And as I explained last week, and with this I end, if you take Turkish coffee, which has never been cooked in hot water, and place it in cold water and wait 1 moment or 2 minutes or 3 or 5 minutes, you will not have a cup of drinkable coffee, even if you were to heat it up. It is true, if you leave it in the cold water for 24 hours or 48 hours, maybe even 12 hours, the water does take on the flavor of the coffee at some point, but that is not called cooking, because there is no heat applied. That is a different kind of process called kavush, or called whatever term you wish to call it. I do not know whatever other term you might use. It is a fact that water takes on, adopts flavors of things soaked in it for a long time. This is something well known, but that is not called cooking, because no heat is involved. Whereas cooking does this process of transferring the flavor of the coffee, shall we say, to the water in a very short space of time, in a matter of seconds, because of the heat involved. And we all see with our own eyes that even in a kli shalishi, you can produce a passable cup of Turkish coffee, even in a kli shalishi. That is a fact. Whereas if you were to use cold or even lukewarm water, this would not be the case. I wish to make that clear, because in my view, la'niyut da'athi, taking, and this also applies to another question that was asked regarding using a French press to make coffee on Shabbat. To use any such process on Shabbat involves an isur Torah of bishul, la'niyut da'athi, in my opinion, and therefore this has to be understood and must be avoided.
Okay, thank you, Harav. There was another clarification from last week. Mayor Morozov asked last week about, he asked at what temperature is water considered hot enough to cook? He was looking for a clarification. What is the Rav's definition of yad soledet bo? The Rav gave a range last week. Does the Rav have a pasak on that?
I gave a range, and there are different opinions. It is clear, and I won't go into the details now, it is absolutely 100% clear that 45 degrees Celsius is not yad soledet bo. This can be demonstrated from a number of halachic sources, and this was stated categorically by a number of poskim. For example, Hagon, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zitzal, and others mention this figure. 45 degrees centigrade is definitely not yad soledet bo. Precisely at what point one can define it as being such, I do not know exactly how to be scientifically precise, but I would say it is closer to 50 degrees is approximately yad soledet bo.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you, Harav. So there's a couple of sorry, Mayor, are you on the line? Do you need anything clarified there?
No, thank you so much, Rob.
Great. Okay. Got a couple of questions now about borer. The first one is from Binyamin Lemkin. What are the general applications of borer? And he asked to clarify his question. Does it apply to non-food items? And can the Rav give some examples of borer in non-food cases? For example, is it borer to sort out a mess of toys on the floor into separate categories? And then there was also a related borer question, which was in fact Rav Ari Grossman's question about the French press. He was asking about can one make coffee using a French press on Shabbat from a borer point of view?
Well, let's begin with the last question. I do not really understand the question with regards to the French press. If we mean, if we are describing a situation where the ground coffee was put in this device, this French press, and the boiling water was poured over it before Shabbat, but the part that is pressed down in the press, which reason is called the press, it is pressed down, which then causes the coffee grinds that may be on the top to go down to the bottom. Is that borer? It's a very interesting question. I'm not certain that I can give a definitive answer. It might well be considered borer. On the other hand, it's possible that you can drink coffee with the grinds in it as well. Is it really considered soledet? I'm not certain. I would prefer to drink it without the grinds, perhaps. But does that make it soledet? I don't know. I would say that is a moot point. With regards to toys and games and things of that nature, first of all, a general word about games and playing on Shabbat. For children above the age of 8 or 9, certainly 10 years old, it is correct, and certainly Kal Vachomer for adults, it is correct to teach people that Shabbat is not a time for games. It's simply not. Hazal say in the Talmud Yerushalmi, Lo nithanu Shabbatot v'yamim tovim ela la'asok b'Torah. Now, most people, if you ask them how much Torah did you study today, will say, well, the truth is I didn't have very much time. I got up at 6 and I had to go to shul and I had to run off to work, and I work 8, 9 or 10 hours and I come home and I'm exhausted, and then there's the children and there's this and there's that, and before you know it, it's 11 p.m. and I'm exhausted, and how much Torah do you think I could fit into all of that? Now, the fact is different people manage to do different things with their time, and we won't go into all of that now. There is a question of time management and there is a question of priorities and what have you. But having said that, it is entirely true that many people find it very difficult to spend any reasonable amount of time during the day, during the week, to study Torah. Maybe they can find half an hour or 1 hour. Some people perhaps find 2 hours. Some may find more, and that's wonderful, and that's how it should be. But the truth is, it's not so easy for many people. So that being the case, if we are not going to stress the importance of studying Torah in all its different forms, studying Torah includes everything: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Mishnah, Halacha, Talmud Be'iyun, Talmud Be'kiyuth, Musar, whatever, you name it. There's no shortage of things to study. If we are not going to stress that Shabbat and Yom Tov and even Shabbat even more particularly Yom Tov, because on Yom Tov there's the possibility of cooking and preparing food, and there's a miswah involved in doing this. On Shabbat we cannot cook food, we cannot prepare food. If we are not going to stress that Shabbat is not for playing games, but rather for studying Torah, then when are we going to study Torah? When are most people going to find the time to learn that very fascinating and very important Ramban on the parasha that they know about but never got a chance to read properly? Or when are we going to find time to actually understand the halacha of borer, for example, or whatever it may be? Or what the pasuk in, this particular pasuk in Perek Yod Gimel in Mishle is actually referring to, what it means. We may have heard the pasuk, but we never really understood it. Well, maybe it's time we did understand it. Well, how are we going to find the time to understand that pasuk if we don't sit down and study it on Shabbat? Of all times, that's the ideal time to Torah in general, for all people, for men, for women, and for children who are capable of such. Young children obviously are going to play. That's okay. But children who are of the age of hinuch, which begins approximately the age of 7 or 8, depending on the context, and certainly older than that, should be taught that, for example, bicycles are not to be ridden on Shabbat, and ball games are not for Shabbat. I will mention here the statement of the Yerushalmi in the fourth perek of Masechet Ta'aniyot, at a place called Tur Shimon, which some claim refers to an area here in Gush Etzion, perhaps Beitar, was destroyed because one opinion says because of Zanuth, another opinion says Mishum Shesichaku B'Kadur. And then Yerushalmi doesn't say exactly when they played with the Kadur, but in the Midrash Eicha it says they played with the ball on Shabbat. What we understand, and whether this refers to the fact that when you play games with the ball and the ball might roll, it may be in the Reshut HaRabim, or you may roll into Reshut HaRabim, or whether that's the explanation, as the Gra suggests and others, whether it's simply because it's an Ovadin Dehol. This is the important concept I wish to stress here. Ovadin Dehol means Ma'asim Shel Hol. In other words, Ma'asim Shel Yom Hol, weekday activities. Ball games are weekday activities. Riding bicycles are weekday activities. Shabbat has to be a very special, a very different kind of day. There are different levels of how special and how different. In the Yerushalmi, we find that Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai chastised his mother for being too talkative on Shabbat. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai thought that speaking less on Shabbat was commendable, was a proper thing to do. Perhaps he was more mahmir than certain other hachamim. Maybe none of us, certainly I am not on the level of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, and maybe there are not very many people today on that level. But we can certainly learn from such a statement in the Talmud Yerushalmi, that, which is quoted by the Tosafot, that Shabbat is supposed to be a different kind of day. So first of all, games are for children, not for adults. There are more important and more relevant things to do on Shabbat than play games. Is it mutar to take various pieces of various toys and divide them into groups? There is a problem involved in doing that. So it should be avoided, and the children themselves should be encouraged to do that as much as possible.
Okay, thank you. Benjamin, is there anything you wanted to clarify there on the borer issue? Benjamin, are you there? Okay. Maybe he's not mic'd up at the moment. Let's move on to the next question. Thank you very much, Harav. So this is an anonymous question. What formula or text does the Rav use for Friday night Kiddush?
I just want to respond to that question about borer. I just want to quote from the Rambam, because the question was very general, and therefore one could apply to, one could ask 100 different questions to do with borer. I'll just quote what the Rambam says about borer. In Perek Het, in Chot Shabbat, Rambam writes, borer ochel mitoch pasolet. If you have food which you wish to eat, which is mixed up with other things, shells and things which this food is associated, but you do not eat, that's called the pasolet, which you cannot eat. Or there were two kinds of food, and they were mixed up. Two kinds of beans, or two kinds of, I don't know, different foodstuffs, and you wish to separate them into two piles, two groups. If you do this using some kind of implement, like a sieve or something like that, that's your hayav min Torah. That is asur min Torah, the act of borer. If you do it by hand, in order to eat immediately, in other words, let's just say, for example, you have peanuts. Now, peanuts often come inside these shells, the thin brown shell that surrounds the actual nut. And let's say you have lots of these nuts, and they're surrounded by, and they're sort of buried inside these shells, which you don't want to eat. You can select the peanuts from the shells or whatever it is in order to eat right now, and you're doing that by hand, not by some kind of sieve or other utensil. That is entirely mutar. Okay, that's borer ochel mitoch soledet, removing food from that which is not food. The other category the Rambam mentions here is borer pesolet mitoch ha'ochel. If one does the opposite, one removes the pesolet, the inedible part of the whatever it is before you, from that which is edible. The pesolet is removed from the ochel, and even if you do that using your hands and not using an implement, that is also hayav. That is asur min haTorah. Okay, those are some basic guidelines. Now, to the question of Kiddush. There are many possible nushaot for Kiddush based on various nushaot and sources that I have seen. I use the following nusach, which is to some large extent of my own composition, I admit, and no one has to feel in any way obligated to use this nusach, but it is a possible nusach, I think. I personally like it, and I think it's clear and straightforward, and it's based on some ancient sources. So what I say is as follows. After the Borei Pri Hagafen, of course, Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu Melech HaOlam, Asher Bahar BeYisrael Amo Mikol HaUmoth, Rosit Habano Mikol HaLashonoth, Watesawenu Lishboth BaShiv'i, Zecher LeMaaseh V'Reshith. Tehila LeMikra Kodesh, Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. V'otanu Kidashta Mikol Ha'amim, V'Shabbatot Kodeshecha Be'ahava V'Simha Hinhaltanu, Baruch Ata Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael V'At Yom HaShabbat. The Hathima, the ending, is explicitly mentioned in the Talmud Yerushalmi. That is clear. And the other parts, each clause I could point to a particular source where this comes up or is mentioned, more or less in those words. That is the nusach I've been using for some years.
Thank you very much to the Rav for sharing that with us. There was a follow-up question, which was actually for me, which was in the Bavli and Pesachim, Rav Ahab Bar Yaakov says one must mention Yetziat Mitzrayim in Kiddush Hayom. The Rashbam interprets this to include Friday night tefillah, but no commonly used nushaot do this. Should one mention Yetziat Mitzrayim in this part of the tefillah?
I do not see any reason why one should not or why one cannot do so, but you are correct in pointing out that none of the standard nushaot, including nushaot which would seem to be nushaot from Eretz Yisrael, from the latter Gaonic period, from the Geniza, shall we say, none of the nushaot for the tefillah of Leil Shabbat seem to include a mention of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Why is this so? I think this would tend to indicate that the simple perush of what Rabbi Bar Yaakov states about Kiddush Hayom does not apply to tefillah. The simple meaning of Kiddush Hayom is Kiddush, what we call Kiddush, which is done on a cup of wine normally. And if wine is not available, or for other reasons, one can make Kiddush on the bread, as we know. Kiddush Hayom generally refers to Kiddush and not to Tefillah. It is true the Rashbam says that it refers also to Tefillah. And it's true that once one makes a mention in the Tefillah, in the Shmoneh Esrei, that is to say the Tefillah of Sheva Brachot, I should say, of Leil Shabbat, once one makes a mention of Shabbat in his tefillah, the hova of being mekadesh da Shabbat b'dvarim, one has been yotzeh the hova, one has performed that mitzvah, and then when you say kiddush on the wine, it actually is now no longer min Torah, it is midivrei soferim. Whereas if one did not say the tefillah beforehand, then the Kiddush on the cup of wine is min Torah. Either way, we do both, and we should do both. I think the simple pshat is that Kiddush Hayom does not include tefillah, not like the Pirush of the Rashbam, and the fact that none of the Nushaot include Yetziat Mitzrayim would seem to indicate that this was not the generally understood. This was not how that statement was generally understood.
Thank you, Harav. The next question is from Lewis Gordon. Is tearing letters of wrapping on foodstuff, and specifically safety wrapping, prohibited on Shabbat? What about breaking letters made from icing?
In both cases, it is mutar, in my view. There are those who say it is asur. In my view, in both cases, it is mutar.
Okay, thank you. Lewis, you are on a line? Lewis, would you like to unmute yourself, and do you have anything to clarify?
No, I would just like the Rav, thank the Rav for his clarity and brevity, as always.
Okay, thank you, Louis. Next question is from Hanan in Yerushalayim. Why is it forbidden to manipulate electronic and electrical devices which create no heat, like cell phones and LED lights?
This is a very good question, a very serious question, because as we all know, so many things today work on electricity, something which we all become immediately aware of as soon as there is a power cut. And then all of a sudden, everything that we're trying to do, nothing works. Whether it's the computer or the central heating system, which cannot be switched on because even if it works on gas or some other fuel, it is lit by, is ignited by electricity, etc. So almost everything works with electricity. And for that very reason, although there are different opinions as to the isur of using electricity on Shabbat, there was the opinion, and there still is the opinion of Rabbeinu Hazon Ish Zitzal, that opening and closing an electrical circuit is actually an isur min Torah. But Rabbeinu HaGaon, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zitzal, when he was a fairly young man still, I think he was actually about 20 or in his early 20s, he had a long correspondence with the Hazon Ish, which eventually resulted in a book that Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach published called Moreh Esh, in which he successfully, I believe, I think everyone admits this, deflected and disproved all of the Hazon Ish's claims. So I do not believe, for example, that opening and closing an electrical circuit is a melacha min Torah, as of Boneh and Soter, as the Hazon Ish wrote. And most poskim do not accept that position. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach never suggested it's mutar to use electricity for all kinds of purposes. He just said, I do not know how to define it. Some poskim claim that it involves any sort of nolad, that when you do something which is done by way of electricity, something new comes into being, whatever it may be that didn't exist before. That's also a complicated and lengthy discussion. I would say, for the purposes of this brief question and answer session, that the category of vadin, the whole, the very same category we spoke of before, which is used by Hazal to ban many things on Shabbat, because of the great necessity and the absolute imperative of maintaining the kedusha and the special nature of Shabbat, we must refrain from all manner of things which would impinge on that special nature of Shabbat. And I think it's clear to all people that if we were to use our phones and our laptops and what have you on Shabbat as we do during the week, this would radically alter the atmosphere and the appreciation and feeling people have for Shabbat, and it would not lead to anything very good, but rather, even if you were to claim that there's no melacha involved at all, but it is certainly obadin the whole. It is something that is entirely wrapped up with 101 various weekday activities, and I think this is the overall and most fundamental and basic reason to outlaw such activities on Shabbat.
Thank you. Hanan, do you have anything to be clarified?
Yeah, can you hear?
We can hear you.
Thank you, Rav, for answering the question. I'm just wondering then, if the issue is over the Dachol, then if we said, say we had a Kindle e-reader or something, and
I'm afraid I lost you.
a reader with Torah, with a Gemara or some Torah.
Hanan, we can't hear you very well, but I think the follow-up question was, what if you're using it for learning Torah or something Shabbat appropriate, like a Kindle?
I can understand why the question is being asked, but because of the overall nature of the activity, it still falls within the category of within the whole.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Rav. The next question is from Shabtai Kaplan. The Rav touched on this before, so I think we can guess what the answer is going to be. But the question is it permissible to ride a bike on Shabbat for fun?
No, it is not permissible. Again, at least for the very, very valid and significant reason of within the whole. Again, yes, this is a general, almost catch-all kind of category, which Hazal themselves use on a number of occasions to explain that certain things should not be done. And riding a bike is exactly such a thing. There can be other issues involved in riding a bike as well, but so it can often be involved. It could be questions of lest a person come to repair or fix something, or screw on a new screw that is not on the brake cable or something, whatever it might be, which is a legitimate hashash also, because that is similar to what we find at least in the Talmud Bavli with regards to playing a musical instrument, fixing and repairing something, etc. So the answer is no. A bike may not be ridden on Shabbat. Children may ride up to the age that we mentioned before.
Thank you, Arav. I don't see Shabtai on the call, so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Yehoshua Felberg in Harish. A widespread custom in Yemenite communities is to pray Mincha Gedola on Shabbat afternoon. This appears to contradict Shitat HaRambam. Is it preferable to pray Mincha Katana on Shabbat as usual, or is it permissible to pray Mincha Gedola as these communities are accustomed?
All right. Well, it is true that historically, certainly till about 300 odd years ago, the Temanim largely, but not exclusively, and not in all matters, not completely, but largely followed the opinion of the Rambam. About 300 or more years ago, things began to change. The famous Temani Rav, Rabbi Maharitz, Rabbi Yahya, the famous Maharitz who wrote the famous Tiklal and other famous works. When in his younger days, he was more in favor of following the Shulchan Aruch, and later he reverted more to placing more emphasis on the Rambam. He was widely regarded by the Temanim as the greatest rabbi and the most authoritative about 300 odd years ago. The fact is that the Temanim today, at least, and much has happened in the last 300 years, of course, and things have changed even in the last 3 generations. I recall speaking to elderly Temani gentlemen who were born in Sana'a or Aden or other places, who I asked them questions about what was done, what practices, what minhagim existed, etc. And the answers they gave me made it quite clear that most Temanim today do not necessarily know what was going on in Teman 100 years ago, shall we say. At any rate, today in Israel, the Temanim, it cannot be said that most Temani communities follow the Rambam to the letter. Now, particularly with regards to the Zman for Mincha, it is true. According to Rambam, L'chatchila, one should daven Mincha Chetana and not Mincha Gedola. Mincha Gedola is the time for Mincha Gedola begins a half hour or Hasisha Azmanith after Hasot Hayom, after midday. And Mincha Chetana begins 9.5 hours after, from Sha'ot Zmaniyot, relative hours, counting from sunrise. In other words, about 2.5 relative hours or Sha'ot Zmaniyot before sunset. There's no question that's the view of the Rambam. Even according to the Rambam, there are times one is allowed to daven Mincha Gedola, such as when one knows that one is going to have to travel or do some other activity, be involved in something later, which will not really allow one to daven Mincha at a later time. Let's say you know you're going to have to be on a bus or a train or a plane or what have you, and it's not really convenient, or that reality is not conducive to davening with kawana. So it's better to daven Mincha Gedola rather than try and daven at the right time, but in a situation where you are not likely to have so much kawana. Also, if you're invited to a big banquet, a celebratory meal, such as a brit milah or a wedding, which is going to take place in the afternoon or later in the day, you are l'chatchila allowed to daven Mincha Gedola first. Now, I am not personally familiar with this particular minhag of Temani communities davening Mincha Gedola. If they do so, it depends really on their reason for doing so. If it is because they want to fit in shiur and suda shlishit at a reasonable time, that might be a reasonable, that may be a legitimate reason for doing so. Temani communities that I myself have had experience of actually did not do so. They did tend to daven Mincha earlier than most other places. Not in other words, not at the end of the day. They tended to daven something around Mincha Ketana time, and that's the ideal time. But there are, and also another very legitimate reason might be that for whatever reason, the community knows, because they are familiar with the nefashot ha'po'alot, the people involved, that they know that if they say Mincha will be at 1:30 or 12:30 or whatever, then there will be a minyan. And if they say Mincha will be at 4, there won't be a minyan for whatever reason, because people are asleep, or people went to visit someone else, or people have a shiur, whatever the reason may be. So such reasons are legitimate reasons for davening Mincha early.
Thank you. I don't think Yoshua is on the line, so we'll move on to an anonymous question. Again, this is something that the Rav has touched on already, but there's a slightly different angle to this. The anonymous person asks, there are many things we can't do on Shabbat, but what should we be doing on Shabbat? For those of us who find it difficult or impossible to learn Torah all day, what is Shabbat for?
What is Shabbat for? Shabbat is for connecting to ourselves, connecting to Hashem, which is the same thing really. This does not have to necessarily be done through study from a book. It often is, and Talmud Torah, studying Torah, is an essential part of being a Jew. No Jew can be a good Jew without studying Torah regularly. That's a simple, straightforward fact. Every Jew is required to study Torah, but yes, not all people are able to study Torah all day long. But then again, how many hours in the day, even on a long Shabbat, are there actually for studying Torah? If one deducts the time spent in shul, davening, family meals, with or without guests, these things take quite a fair amount of time. So how many hours really of the day are left for studying Torah? Halawai that most people would find 4 or 5 or 6 hours to study Torah. I don't think that most people actually can find that many hours, even on a Shabbat. And now, studying Torah, it has to be made clear, does not mean only studying Gemara or Halakha. It includes studying all manner, all areas of Torah study. Some can be much easier and less demanding than others. One can even set up a time when one reads some material which is of a Torah nature with one's wife, with one's children at the table. One can definitely go for a walk on Shabbat, that's mutar. One can visit friends on Shabbat, that's mutar. One can go out into nature and enjoy being at one with nature and with Hashem on Shabbat. All these things are mutar. The overall purpose of Shabbat is to be aware constantly. In fact, not just on the day of Shabbat itself, but in fact throughout the week. And that is to say, every day of our lives. And that is the meaning of the pasuk, Zochor et Yom HaShabbat, Lekadesho, Zochor, written with a chames under the zayin, does not mean thou shalt remember, but rather thou shalt be mindful. One is required to be in a state of zechira, of constant awareness of Shabbat, which means that one is to be constantly aware that Hashem, there is a creator to the world, Yesh Adon, Yesh Melech Labira, there is a creator of the world, Hashem created the world, and the Ma'aseh Bereshit is related to us in the Torah in such a way that it corresponds to a week of 6 days and a 7th day of rest. And by doing so once a week and being makdish, by dedicating 1 day a week to a particularly mindful state of this awareness, we are laying the foundation of what it means to be Jewish. Without this awareness, we're not Jews at all. The essential difference between the Jewish people and every other nation is that we are supposed to live in a constant state of mindfulness and awareness of Hashem and that which we find in the Torah, and that which He instructs us, and that is to be always in the back of our minds. In the back of our minds. On Shabbat, it's both in the back and in the front of our minds. It's very obvious and clear because we are creating a special kind of day. Any activity which is conducive to that mindfulness is appropriate for Shabbat. And those things that tend to distract us from that, such as we mentioned before, all manner of game playing and what have you, is not really very conducive to that end.
Okay. Thank you, Harav. The next question is from Svi in Queens. Are pet birds and bird cages muktzeh on Shabbat?
No, they are not muktzeh on Shabbat. Pets may be dealt with, may be fed, may be walked, animals that need to be taken out for a walk on Shabbat. This is mutar, they are not muktzeh.
Svi, anything to be clarified there?
No, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. The next question is also from Svi. Can one chop salads finally on Shabbat?
This is a surprisingly difficult question. We find in I feel I have to explain a little bit more in detail here. We find in Masechet Shabbat in Talmud Bavli, Ain Dara Amud Bet, Amar Rav Papa, Hai man de pare silaka hayav mishum tohen. And Rashi explains that we are talking about cutting silaka. Silaka is in Hebrew selek, which is beetroot or beets, cutting it very fine, chopping it very fine. Rashi says, Mehatcho hedek. Now, some Rishonim, like the Rosh, were very surprised at this Perush of Rashi. Why should it be considered tohen when you are cutting up food that you wish to eat immediately? But the fact is that many other Rishonim definitely agree with Rashi's interpretation. Rabbeinu Hananel says that it is asur to grind or to pulverize such foods as opposed to cutting them. And the Or Zarua explains that he thinks Rabbeinu Hananel means that you can cut them, but not very, very fine. Now, of course, the question is, what is very, very fine? I do not know how to define very, very fine. I can tell you that Rambam mentions this halakha in 3 places. I wish to quote them to you very briefly. In Ilchot Shabbat, in Perek Zayin, Halakha Hey, Rambam says, Hamahatech et hayarak ma'at ma'at levashelo. Ma'at ma'at apparently means very fine. Levashelo, in order to cook it. And Rambam includes a new concept here, a new word. He says, with the purpose of cooking it. Hareza hayav, because this is the malacha of tohen, says Rambam. Rambam further says in Perek Het, Halakha Tet Zayin, Hamahatech yarak talush, hareze soledet tohen. Basically, there's no hidush, there's no extra information in that second mention of this halakha. In Perek Kaf Aleph, where generally this Perek deals with things which are not min ha-Torah, but rather midivei soferim. As Rambam begins this Perek, Ne'emar b'Torah tishboth, afilu midvarim she'enam malacha, says Rambam. Rambam in this Perek states, in Halakha Yod Het, Hamahatech et hayarak dak dak, which is why I said before, ma'at ma'at apparently means the same as dak dak, very fine. Kedei levashelo, in order to cook it, hareze soledet tohen. From all this, one might understand, and one might be correct. It's not clear to me, and it's I'm not the only person to whom this is not very clear. It's not clear to me if Rambam's shita is that cutting vegetables such as beetroot or similar vegetables that are generally cooked, although I must point out that I know for a fact that you can eat, if you grate beetroot quite fine, you can eat it raw. It's perfectly edible and tasty. But generally, beetroot is cooked. Does Rambam understand this halakha applies only to vegetables or foods that are cooked, and then and cutting them very finely, chopping them very finely was considered preparation for cooking, and this is part of the reason it's asur, and therefore foods that are not generally cooked, such as well, let's take a simple example: a cucumber. The cucumbers are not cooked. Does it mean that Rambam holds that such a food this halakha does not apply to such a food which is eaten raw? Possibly, and there are poskim who understood it this way. However, in the Yerushalmi we find that if you grind up, although it speaks there about using a grinder, if you grind up a raw piece of garlic, you are hayav mishum tohen. And the Chazon Ish points out very correctly that this is a clear proof that even foods that are eaten raw, such as garlic certainly can be eaten raw. It can be cut up and often is chopped up quite fine and mixed into other foods. It talks there about the fact that the melacha of tohen is relevant when it comes to foods that are eaten raw as well. So the bottom line is there is a great deal of confusion, quite frankly, regarding this halakha. It is not straight. It is somewhat, how shall I put it? It is halakha that is difficult to achieve absolute clarity with regards to this halakha, and therefore I think the correct thing to do is not to chop up any foodstuffs on Shabbat very fine. Very fine means that something very, very small pieces that are close to being ground or pulverized. If you chop vegetables for a salad into average salad-sized cubes, that's perfectly okay. Some people make, or what they refer to as Israeli salad, some people call it that, where the vegetables are cut up into very, very small pieces, that should be avoided.
Okay. Thank you, Rav. Svi, anything to be clarified there?
Yes. So basically, if we personally don't do it ourselves, if a family member does chop it up like that, should we tell them not to do it, or since it's a mahloket, we could not say anything?
Seeing that there is good reason to think that there's an Isur Torah involved here, we should tell people. We should try and do so in such a manner that our words will be heeded and will not cause mahlokat, but we should tell people that there is such a halacha. It's mefurash in the Gemara. There are definitely opinions that hold that it is asur and possibly even min Torah to chop very, very finely, and therefore we should cut them. We can cut them. We can cut them into pieces, but not into very, very fine pieces. Not very finely chopped.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Yehoshua Felberg, who's still in Harish. Could the Rav please set out the correct way of making Havdalah? Is it necessary to use a candle with multiple wicks? What spices should one use for the besamim? Is it permissible to use beer, or as some are accustomed in England, milk instead of wine? That's all.
Okay. The first question was about the candle.
Wicks. Is it necessary to use a candle with multiple wicks?
Is it correct or necessary to use a multi-wicked candle?
Correct.
This
Yes.
idea, the simple answer is it is not absolutely necessary, but it is a mitzvah min muvhar. It is desirable. Why? It is mentioned. This is mentioned in the Talmud Bavli in Pesachim Daf Kof Gimel, where one Chacham says to the other, "Do you not hold that avuka mitzvah min muvhar?" Avuka means literally a torch, or not just a simple candle which has one small flame, but rather a larger flame. Now, one way of creating a larger flame is to have several wicks, and then you have a larger flame than a simple candle. So, but there's no question that if you do not have such a candle, if you have just a simple candle with one wick, or even if you have just a box of matches, you can light a match and say the bracha boreh moreh ha'esh on that, and that's sufficient. Yetzateh le'chova bli safek, no question. But it is a mitzvah min ha'muvhar to use a larger multi-wicked or candle, or some kind of larger torch-like object which has a more serious flame to it. The reason for this is, and in the Gemara there it relates how at the end when these Chachamim were sitting around eating on Shabbat, and the end of Shabbat came along, the servant of the Baal Habayit went and took a torch, that is to say some kind of avuka, some kind of larger flame, and lit it, or a torch which can be made into a larger flame, and lit it from a candle that was already alight. In other words, we see there is a preference for such a thing. Why this is so? There are two possible explanations. The Meiri, the Ran, and other Rishonim mention the Gemara in Masechet Berachot Daf Nun Beth, where we have the discussion between Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel about the nusach of the bracha, right? Beth Shammai say that the nusach of the bracha in Havdalah is Shebara Me'or Ha'esh in the singular, and also in the Lashon Avar Shebara, although it can be understood also to include the present, as the Gemara says. And Beth Hillel say the nusach of the bracha is Boreh Me'oreh Ha'esh in the plural. And the statement the statement of the Gemara, Daf Nun Bet Hamud Bet in Talmud Bavli, Amru lahem beit Hillel levet Shammai harbe me'orot yesh ba'or. There are different kinds of light, and Rashi explains, Shalhevet aduma levana v'yirakreket v'yirakraka. I think it should probably say in Rashi. In other words, we all know that when you look at a flame, particularly a larger flame which is flickering and jumping, we see different shades of color in the flame. We see there are parts of the flame which are bluish or greenish, yellow, red, orange. In other words, the reason Beth Hillel gives why we say me'oreh hayesh in the plural is because there is more than one kind of light in fire. And this is more readily observable when you have a larger flame, when you have a multi-wick candle. And that is the reason it is preferable to use such a candle. That is one explanation. Another explanation is simply to say that a larger flame is more muhudar, is nicer, is more impressive, is something there's more ra'ui to make a bracha on than a small little, sometimes almost imperceptible flame. If you have a small candle and you light that candle, yes, there is a small flame there at the end of the wick, you can see it, but it's not something very, something to write home about, as we say. There's nothing that it doesn't really strike one as so remarkable or special or impressive. Whereas a larger flame, which also sheds more light and also, as we said, shows more clearly the various colors and bandwidths, wavelengths of light in the fire, that is preferable. But it's a miswam and a muvhar, not a chova. So it's preferable, and if it's available, we do that. What was the other question with regards to Havdalah?
Next one was spices. What spices should one use?
There's no particular spice or fragrance that one must use. Any sweet-smelling substance is acceptable. If it's let's say one has a bottle of perfume, that's what one happens to have. Very often we don't know exactly what substances went into making that perfume. So we would say boreh mineh v'samim, which is a general bracha on v'samim, on sweet-smelling substances. If it's something such as a twig or branch of hadassim, then we say boreh aseh v'samim because it's a kind of tree, and there are other kinds of v'samim which are isbeh v'samim. They're a kind of grass or don't qualify as a tree. Well, that depends on the source of the spice. But anything that is a pleasant smell to it is acceptable, and therefore there's no particular. You don't have to use it. If the question is, do you have to use cloves, for example? No, you do not have to use cloves. If cloves are available and you like them, that's good. If you prefer something else, you can use something else, whatever takes your fancy.
And thank you. The final part of Yoshua's question was whether it's permissible to use beer or milk instead of wine.
This is a more serious question. That is to say, requires a more serious answer. I do not think there is any legitimate reason to use or to make do with milk or even with coffee or tea, which I've heard some people also claim they might use or could use for Havdalah. If there was nothing else available, then possibly, but even then, I'm not even convinced of that. There is a teshuvah of the Radal, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, where he explains that, and I think he brings very good proofs and argumentation to demonstrate this, that whatever one uses for Havdalah, if it's not going to be wine, and it's preferable that it be wine, as I'm about to say, then it has to be something which is alcoholic, that it has some oomph to it, so to speak, that is something, it's not just a regular beverage, even if it's a tasty beverage, but it has to be something with some alcoholic content. Now in Bavel, we know that in Bavel, wine was more expensive, sometimes prohibitively so, and sometimes very difficult to come by, as opposed to Eretz Yisrael, where wine was not hard to come by. So this was discussed much more in greater detail than in the Talmud Yerushalmi. There seemed to be no problem of obtaining wine in Eretz Yisrael. In Bavel, it was an issue. So we do find, based on the Talmud Bavli, that it is possible to make Kiddush and Kal Vachomer, even Havdalah on beer. But I would add to that the following proviso. It is always preferable and correct to use wine or grape juice. If wine cannot be used for whatever reason, if a person doesn't agree with a person, or a person doesn't enjoy drinking wine, prefers grape juice. Wine or grape juice are definitely preferable. They are considered more mehudar. This is the beverage about which it says Yani Samah Levav Enosh. This is the beverage, this is the liquid, the drink that was used in the Mikdash as part of Avodat HaMikdash, Yisuch HaYayin. And these are some of the reasons why Hazal instituted these various miswot of Kiddush and Havdalah, like the bracha at the Brit Milah or Sheva Brachot on a cup of wine. Wine is always preferable. And this I say not only with regards to Havdalah, also with regards to Kiddush in the morning, b'shaharith. Some people, particularly amongst the Ashkenazim, tend to, in some places at least, that's the fairly accepted custom, to say Kiddush on spirits, such as whiskey, brandy, vodka, etc. I agree that if wine is unavailable, that is possible, but I consider that to be with the avad and not lechatchila. And it became a much more widespread custom in Eastern Europe over the last several centuries, precisely for the same reason that beer in some situations was used instead of wine in Bavel, because wine was not so readily available, it was expensive, and therefore something like vodka, shall we say, was a much more readily obtainable substitute. But today, Baruch Hashem, in almost all places, we are not in a situation where wine or grape juice are hard to come by. If a person is in a place where there is absolutely no wine, he's in a desert island or he's in some far-flung place and there's nothing available, nothing in the way of wine, then yes, then one may use beer, both for Kiddush in the morning and for Havdalah. For Leil Shabbat, Kiddush Leil Shabbat, it is preferable to use bread if bread is available rather than beer.
Thank you, Harav. We've reached the hour, so just finally, Binyamin, I don't know if you heard the Rav's answer to your question earlier about Borer, but if you did, if you wanted anything to be clarified, if you're mic'd up yet.
I see there was a question here. I just want to state here that someone asked on the chat. Is non-alcoholic grape juice preferable to alcoholic non-grape juice drink? The answer is yes.
Okay.
And grape juice has to be pure grape juice.
Okay, thank you for clearing that, Harav. Binyamin, are you with us? I think not. Okay, thank you very much to the Rav for the second time for answering everyone's questions. And thank you for everyone for submitting their questions. I hope we'll do this again. And have a very good night, everyone.
All right.
Thank you, Yasher Koach, to the Rav and to you for arranging this.
Shalom, shalom. חזקו ויאמץ לבבכם כל המייחלים לאדוני.
Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.